All right, Trivium students, we're looking at hypothetical syllogisms this week and the rules by which we can determine if hypothetical syllogisms are valid or invalid. Remember that the only two steps by which a hypothetical syllogism can be valid is if it affirms the antecedent or it denies the consequent. So for each one of these hypothetical syllogisms here, we're going to work through it. We're going to need to label the antecedent as P, the consequent as Q, and then see which of those four steps, whether it affirms the antecedent, denies the consequent, or denies the antecedent or affirms the consequent, to determine whether or not these syllogisms are valid or invalid. They don't always have conclusions or even the second premise to a hypothetical syllogism, but they're still pretty easy to work out. Let's go ahead and get started. So if men were angels, no government would be necessary. Men were angels is going to be our antecedent, and no government is going to be our consequent. So no government. And notice that our consequent here includes the idea of having no government. So that's our antecedent here. Men were angels is our antecedent, and no government would be necessary is our consequent. The implied premise, though, is that government is necessary. And because our consequent includes the idea of no government, then this is technically negating that state of affairs and denying the consequent, right? We're saying that government is necessary. Our consequent says that no government is necessary, but we're saying that this cannot be the case. We're negating Q, and then the implied conclusion here is that men are not angels. But this, because it denies the consequent, this particular syllogism here is valid. Moving on to number 2, if there were no reindeer, which we can label as our antecedent, then Santa Claus would not exist. Label this as our consequent, Q. Santa Claus would not exist. Now this state of affairs, in our second premise, is negated, right? So we're denying Q here. So this is denying the consequent. Remember, our consequent states that Santa Claus does not exist, whereas this next premise here states that Santa Claus does exist. So it's negating the consequent, denying the consequent, and then as a result, we're stating a state of affairs opposite to what is stated in the antecedent, therefore not P. So this syllogism here is going to be valid. All right? If ice were heavier than water, ponds would freeze solid in winter. Our antecedent is here. If ice were heavier than water, and our consequent is the proposition that follows, ponds would freeze solid in winter. So we'll label that as Q. So if P, then Q. The next premise in our hypothetical syllogism is stating that ice is not heavier than water. Remember that our antecedent is the proposition ice is heavier than water. So we're negating P here. We're denying the antecedent. And that, I know right off the bat that is an invalid form of reasoning for hypothetical syllogisms. You can't deny the antecedent and prove that the consequent does not exist either. This is an invalid syllogism as a result. The idea that ponds do not freeze solid in winter, I know off the bat that that's not a true proposition, and even so, it does not follow from the premises in this argument because this is an invalid form of reasoning for a hypothetical syllogism. Let's go on to number 4. Either wealth is evil or it is good. Wealth is not evil, therefore wealth is good. It looks like we'll have to rework this into a hypothetical syllogism. So if wealth is evil, then it is not good. It is not good. Our antecedent is here, wealth is evil. And our consequent is the statement that follows, then it is not good. Wealth is evil, then it is not good. Notice how our consequent here includes the word not here in its state of affairs. The next premise in our hypothetical syllogism is stating that wealth is not evil. And what we're doing here is we are denying the antecedent, which is an invalid form of reasoning. I know that right off the bat. Notice that wealth is good. We're denying the antecedent here, saying that wealth is not evil, and then denying the consequent as a result that wealth is good is the conclusion that we're stating here. but this is an invalid form of reasoning for hypothetical syllogism. You can't deny the antecedent and have the conclusion, i.e. the idea that wealth is good, necessarily follow from the premises that are stated. All right, let's go on to the next one. Number 5, if his clothing carries traces of radioactivity, then he was in the area. His clothing carries no traces of radioactivity, therefore he was not in the area. Our antecedent is here. This is P. His clothing has traces of radioactivity. And then our consequent is here. Then he was in an area presumably where they're handling really bad stuff. So this is our consequent here. So if P, then Q. The next premise, the second premise of our hypothetical syllogism states his clothing carries no traces of radioactivity. Remember, the idea of his clothing carrying radioactivity or not was our antecedent. So we're effectively denying the antecedent, which I know right off the bat is an invalid form of reasoning. Therefore, he was not in the area. Remember, that was our consequence. So we're negating our antecedent. We're denying our antecedent, saying that state of affairs did not exist, and then we are getting the idea that he was not in the area as a result, and that really that's an invalid form of reasoning and does not follow from the premises that are stated here. All right, let's go on to the next one. The human mind were an information processing system like a computer, then creativity would be hard to explain. Creativity is hard to explain, therefore the mind is not an information processing system like a computer. So our antecedent is here. If the mind were like a computer, and I'll label that P, then creativity would be hard to explain. So I've got my antecedent and my consequent here. The next premise, the second premise in my hypothetical syllogism states that creativity is hard to explain. Remember, that's our consequent here, so we're affirming Q. Therefore, the human mind is not an information processing system like a computer. So we're affirming the consequent and negating our antecedent. We're denying our antecedent. This, I know off the bat, is an invalid form of reasoning. You can't affirm the consequent and have the truth of the conclusion necessarily follow from your premises. All right, let's go on to the last one. Number 7, if there is a heavy rainy season, we will have a good harvest. We had a good harvest, so we must have had a heavy rainy season. Our antecedent is here. If there is a heavy rainy season, and our consequent is the proposition that follows, we will have a good harvest. We can label that as Q. So if P, then Q. And the second premise in this hypothetical syllogism affirms that we had a good harvest, so we're affirming our consequent, right? That's Q, which I know off the bat is an invalid form of reasoning for hypothetical syllogisms. So our conclusion, we must have had a rainy season, a heavy rainy season, does not necessarily follow as a result. You know, there are other reasons why we may have had a heavy rainy season, or that we had there's the conclusion does not necessarily follow from the premises that are stated here. All right, nice work.